You know, I always thought of myself as a lucky guy. I had a stable job, two healthy kids, and a wife who seemed like the ideal partner anyone could ask for. I met Sarah back in college, and over the years, we built what I believed was the perfect family. She was my everything. When we got married, I was certain that she shared this vision of ours, to live together, to grow together, to support each other through anything life threw at us. We'd been through plenty, just like any family, but we always came through it together. With two young kids, I thought we were living the American dream, the kind of life people look at and say, now that's a real family. Sarah was a fantastic mother, devoted to the kids and, I thought, to me as well. Or at least, that's what I believed. But a few months back, small things started catching my eye. Sarah had become a little distant. She started being glued to her phone in ways that felt new and strange, always angling the screen away or taking it with her if I got too close. After years together, I could sense little shifts like this, but I couldn't bring myself to believe they meant anything serious. I kept wondering if maybe I was imagining things. I even told myself, don't be ridiculous. Sarah would never do anything to hurt you. And for a while, I almost believed that. Then, the turning point came at our daughter's birthday party. It was a warm, joyful evening with all our family and friends gathered together. Sarah was in her element, laughing, serving everyone food, doting on the kids. For a brief moment, I thought my fears were just in my head. But as she was showing me some photos of the kids on her phone, a message notification popped up right there at the top of her screen. I love you more. It was from a guy named Mike. My stomach dropped. I could barely breathe for a second. Sarah quickly brushed it off, almost too quickly. She laughed and said, "Oh, that's just a coworker. He's been having a rough time, and I've been helping him out." She made it sound like no big deal, like it was nothing to even think about. But there was something too polished about her response, as if she had this story ready to go. And all I could think was, why would a coworker text that? And why is she so relaxed about it? I tried to shake it off. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe it was just a strange joke that didn't mean anything. But now, that doubt was lodged in my mind. The rest of the night, I forced myself to smile, to go along with the party, and not make a scene. Family and friends were all around, laughing, toasting, celebrating. I didn't want to be the guy who ruins his daughter's birthday party by calling his wife out in front of everyone. But inside, I was falling apart. The night seemed to drag on forever, and I was trapped, counting down the minutes until everyone would finally go home. The next day, when the house was finally quiet again and the kids were asleep, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I approached Sarah, trying to stay calm. She looked up from her coffee, perfectly composed. I knew I had to ask, no matter how hard it was. I asked her, "Who is Mike? Really? And why did he say he loves you?" She froze for a split second, just a flicker of something in her eyes before she quickly composed herself again. I could feel her calculating. Then she sighed and launched into this well-crafted story, one that I would later realize was full of holes and, honestly, flat-out lies. "It's just my coworker, like I told you," she said, her voice annoyingly calm. "We're just friends. I've been helping him through some family issues lately, being there for him when he needs to talk. That's all." The way she said it, so smooth and without any hesitation, almost had me fooled. It sounded plausible enough. Maybe I was overreacting, being too suspicious. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt something was terribly wrong. Her words were too rehearsed, too perfect, and deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that my whole world was about to come crashing down. After that night, I thought maybe I could just let it go. I wanted to believe her. I wanted so badly for this to just be some big misunderstanding, a bad joke. But things didn't add up. Once the doubt was there, every little thing she did seemed to set off alarms. She'd laugh a little too brightly when she got a text, and then I'd catch her glancing over at me, as if she were checking to see if I noticed. She'd say she was working late more often, or mention that she was meeting friends for girls' night, something she rarely did before. My gut told me something was seriously wrong, but my heart was fighting me every step of the way. I couldn't bear the idea of her actually betraying me. I'd look at our kids, at their innocent faces, and think, No, Sarah wouldn't do this. Not to them. Not to us. So, I kept trying to ignore the signs, convincing myself that this was all a product of my own insecurities. But then came the day everything changed. It was a Friday night, and I was supposed to pick up our son from his soccer practice. Sarah had left earlier that afternoon, saying she had errands to run and might meet us at the field. When I got there, I noticed her car parked in the far lot, near the edge by the trees. I thought it was strange since she usually parked up front when she came to practices. As I was walking over to get our son, I spotted Sarah. Only she wasn't alone. She was standing by the bleachers with a man I'd never seen before, talking closely, leaning in a little too intimately. It was Mike. She didn't even need to introduce him. He looked about my age, maybe a bit younger, in jeans and a t-shirt, way too casual for just a coworker. I felt this sharp twist in my chest, like someone was squeezing the life out of me. They didn't see me at first, so I took a few seconds to gather myself, my mind reeling. She told me so many times he was just a friend. But that was not how you stand next to just a friend. When Sarah finally noticed me, her expression changed instantly. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, and that was all the confirmation I needed. The guilt, the shame, it was written all over her face. For a second, I almost felt bad for her, as crazy as that sounds. But then, all I could feel was anger. I walked up to them, trying to keep my composure in front of our son, who was obliviously kicking a soccer ball nearby. I said, "So this is Mike?" My voice was calm, but I could feel every muscle in my body tensed, barely holding it together. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mike, to his credit, or lack thereof, just stood there looking uncomfortable. He didn't say a word. Eventually, Sarah muttered something about how they just happened to run into each other, and were catching up. I stared at her, knowing this was a blatant lie. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to make a scene. Our son was there, other parents and kids were nearby, and I felt trapped by the need to keep it together. I forced a smile, said something about heading home, and took our son's hand, leading him back to the car. The entire drive home, my mind was spinning. She looked terrified, like she knew she'd been caught but didn't have a way to talk herself out of it. And Mike? He'd been utterly useless, looking at me like I was some kind of inconvenience to his evening. By the time we got home, my anger had reached a breaking point. Later that night, when the kids were asleep, I finally confronted her. She'd barely said a word since we left the field, and now she was pacing the living room, clearly dreading what was coming. I asked her point blank, "How long has this been going on, Sarah? Don't lie to me." She froze, then dropped into the nearest chair, covering her face with her hands. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but I wasn't buying it. I asked again, my voice rising despite myself. I wanted the truth. I wanted her to finally say the words so I could stop feeling like I was losing my mind. Eventually, she looked up, her eyes wet, and said, "It's not what you think. Mike and I are just close. You know, as friends. He's going through a lot, and I've been there for him." She kept going on about how he was having problems in his own relationship, how he needed someone to talk to. But when I reminded her about the message I'd seen, "I love you more," she paused. She tried to explain it away, saying it was just something people say, that it wasn't literal. I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. It was like she was spinning this elaborate story right in front of me, thinking I was some idiot who would believe anything she said. I asked her if she'd been seeing him outside of work, and she hesitated, then mumbled something about a few friendly meetups, just coffee or a walk to clear his head. I could barely keep it together as she went on about how she was doing nothing wrong, and that I was blowing this out of proportion. At that point, I felt this wave of exhaustion hit me. I realized she was never going to come clean. Not fully. She was going to spin whatever story she needed to make herself look innocent, or at least less guilty. I didn't even know who I was looking at anymore. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the Sarah I thought I'd married. This person in front of me was someone who would lie, who would manipulate me, just to protect her own selfish interests. That night, I barely slept. The anger, the the confusion, the feeling of betrayal. It all twisted inside me like a knot I couldn't untangle. I kept hearing her voice, repeating those weak excuses, seeing that panicked look in her eyes when she realized I'd seen her with him. Part of me felt like a fool for letting it get this far, for ignoring all the signs. But part of me still hoped that somehow, this could all be fixed. But deep down, I already knew. This was just the beginning of a much darker road. The days that followed were like living in a bad dream. Every moment I was around her felt like a performance I couldn't escape from. I tried to go about my daily routine, act normal for the kids, but I was a mess on the inside. Sarah, though, seemed fine. Too fine. She continued her usual routines, smiled at the kids, and even made small talk with me as if nothing was wrong. It was like she'd compartmentalized everything, shoving me and the affair into separate boxes, and that made me feel even more alone. She'd effectively built a wall between us, and I was just on the outside, pounding on it, hoping she'd let me in and give me the truth. But that day never came. Then, a week later, a friend of ours, James, invited me to what he called a surprise party. He said it was for his brother's promotion, and Sarah had already RSVP'd for us. I didn't really feel like going, but James was insistent, and Sarah was practically begging me to get out of the house for once. "It'll be fun," she said with one of those bright smiles that felt hollow now. Reluctantly, I agreed. The night of the party, Sarah was in an unusually good mood, and it bothered me. She took longer than usual to get ready, fussing over her makeup, her dress, her shoes. She was practically glowing, and for some reason, it made me feel sick. I chalked it up to stress, to paranoia maybe. I told myself I was overthinking it, but the feeling just wouldn't go away. When we arrived, everything seemed normal at first. There was music, drinks, laughter. Everyone was having a good time. I even found myself relaxing a bit, caught up in a conversation with some friends. Sarah had drifted off somewhere, but I didn't mind. I needed a break from thinking about her. For a few minutes, it felt like the cloud over my head lifted. But that was short-lived. About an hour into the party, I noticed Sarah was still nowhere to be found. I glanced around, hoping she was just chatting in another room or out on the patio. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I tried to let it go. But then I heard a few hushed voices near the hallway and noticed some guests exchanging uncomfortable looks, whispering. My gut twisted again. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I made my way through the crowd toward the hall. As I got closer, I heard muffled laughter and whispers, and then I froze. There, through the doorway, I saw Sarah, my wife, pressed up close against Mike, laughing at something he'd said, her hand on his chest, his arm around her waist. She looked carefree, radiant, happy in a way I hadn't seen in months. They didn't see me standing there, watching them like a stranger watching a train wreck. And in that moment, I knew. All her lies, all the vague excuses and late nights, every suspicion I'd pushed down came roaring back, too overwhelming to ignore. I didn't care about making a scene anymore. I stepped forward, into the room, and they noticed me at the same time. Sarah went pale, her hand falling from his chest. Mike looked shocked, frozen like he couldn't believe he'd been caught so openly. Everyone around us grew quiet, the laughter and music fading as people turned to watch. I walked up to them, my heart pounding, and before I knew it, the words came spilling out. "So, this is what you meant by just a friend, huh?" My voice was louder than I intended, but I didn't care. I needed everyone to hear. I needed Sarah to face the truth, to stop pretending. Sarah's face twisted into some mix of anger and guilt. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. Then she stammered, "It's not what it looks like, really. I was just talking to him. You're blowing this out of proportion, as usual." Her tone was defiant, like she was already trying to shift the blame onto me, as if I was the one causing the problem. Mike started to say something, but I cut him off. "Save it, Mike," I snapped. "You're not the one I'm talking to here." I turned back to Sarah, my voice shaking as I asked, "How long has this been going on, Sarah? How long have you been lying to me?" The words tasted bitter, laced with anger and betrayal. She looked around, clearly uncomfortable with everyone staring at us, but she didn't move. She just crossed her arms, as if challenging me. "This isn't the time or place for this," she muttered, glancing at the crowd around us. But I was past the point of caring. "When is the time, Sarah? Because all I've gotten from you are lies, so maybe this is exactly the time." The silence was thick. Everyone was watching, and I could see that people were starting to put the pieces together, whispering to each other. Sarah's eyes darted around, desperate, probably wishing she could disappear. Finally, she looked back at me and, with an edge in her voice, said, "Fine. You really want to know? We've been seeing each other for a while, but it's only because you never make time for me. You're always busy with work or with the kids. I needed someone, and you weren't there." Her words cut deep, each one like a knife twisting in the wound. My whole world spun. Not only was she admitting to it, but she was also blaming me, as if her betrayal was my fault. I could feel the humiliation creeping up, burning my face, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do or say. I had come into this room hoping for an answer, hoping she'd deny it, even lie one more time. But this was worse than any lie. This was a slap in the face in front of everyone we knew. I stared at her, unable to process what she just said. "So, this is my fault? You're telling me you've been sneaking around behind my back because of me?" My voice cracked, a mix of hurt and disbelief. She shrugged, her expression hardening. "If you want to put it that way, then yes. Maybe if you'd been a better husband, this wouldn't have happened." Her words were so cold, so calculated, like she'd been waiting to say them. She had no remorse, no shame, just this smug, unbothered look. I laughed, a bitter sound, hollow. "You really are unbelievable, Sarah. Instead of talking to me, instead of working things out, you just go off with him?" I pointed at Mike, who looked like he wanted to vanish into thin air. But Sarah didn't flinch. She just crossed her arms tighter and said, "Life's too short to be unhappy, and I deserve to be happy. If you can't provide that, then maybe we're not right for each other anymore." The room was silent. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but she didn't care. She'd made up her mind. I could see that in the way she looked at me, with that unapologetic defiance. The silence hung heavy around us, like a thick fog that I couldn't shake. The look on her face, that smug defiance, sent a chill down my spine. How could she be so cold, so indifferent? I felt like I was standing across from a stranger, not the woman I'd loved for nearly a decade, not the mother of my children. Around us, people were still staring, whispering. Some looked shocked, others just uncomfortable, but no one moved. No one dared to break the tension. I couldn't stand it. Without saying another word, I turned and walked out. I heard Sarah calling my name, but I ignored her, pushing through the crowd until I was out the door and in the crisp night air. I could barely breathe, each step away from that room feeling both like an escape and a descent into something far worse. As I got into the car, I felt numb, empty. The night was quiet, but my head was anything but. Her words kept echoing, bouncing around in my mind like a cruel taunt. "Life's too short to be unhappy, and I deserve to be happy." Was that all I was to her now? Just an obstacle, a burden standing in the way of her happiness? I'd given everything to our family to her, and in return, she'd given me this. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, trying to hold back the waves of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak that threatened to consume me. I drove aimlessly for a while, barely noticing where I was going. I thought about calling someone, my brother, maybe, but I couldn't bring myself to. I didn't want to say it out loud, to admit what had just happened. Eventually, I ended up parked outside a diner. It was one of those places Sarah and I used to go to back in college, before the kids, before the mortgage, before everything got so complicated. I sat there in the dark, staring through the window at the booths inside, and wondered how we'd gone from that young, hopeful couple to this. Finally, I pulled myself together enough to head home. I had no idea what I'd say to her, or if I'd even be able to face her, but I knew I had to go back. The kids would be asleep by now, and they didn't deserve to wake up to all of this. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Sarah's car was already there. The house was dark, save for a faint light coming from the living room. When I walked inside, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, her face set in that same unyielding expression she'd had at the party. She didn't even look at me as I closed the door, just stared straight ahead, almost as if she were waiting for me to say something. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe an apology, or at least some sign of regret. But there was nothing, just silence. I sat down across from her, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah," I began, my voice low, "how did we get here? How did you go from being my wife to whatever this is?" She finally turned to look at me, but her eyes were cold, unrecognizable. "I told you already. I've been unhappy for a long time, and I needed something more. Something you couldn't give me." I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You never told me you were unhappy. You never even gave me a chance. You just went off and found him." I spat out the word, the bitterness thick on my tongue. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you talk to me?" She sighed, like she was tired of the whole conversation. "Because, honestly, I didn't think you'd understand. You've always been so focused on work, on the kids, on everything else. I felt invisible, and Mike, he made me feel seen." Those words stung, more than I expected. I tried so hard to be a good husband, a good father. I thought I was doing everything right, and here she was, telling me that it still wasn't enough. I felt like I'd failed, like I'd been a fool all this time, thinking that love and loyalty would be enough to keep us together. "You know what?" I said, my voice breaking despite myself. "I would have done anything for you, Sarah. Anything. All you had to do was tell me." My throat tightened, and I fought back the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm me. "But instead, you chose to betray me, to go behind my back with him." She just shrugged, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe it was wrong, but I was tired of waiting for things to get better. I wanted to feel alive again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Feel alive? By destroying our family? By putting the kids through this? My voice rose, and for the first time, I didn't care if I sounded angry. She needed to understand the gravity of what she'd done, the lives she was shattering with her selfishness. She looked away, like she couldn't be bothered to answer. "I think I'm done here," she finally said, standing up. "I think it's best if I sleep in the guest room tonight." She brushed past me without another word, disappearing down the hall and leaving me sitting there in the dim light of the living room, stunned and alone. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every moment we'd shared over the past 8 years. I couldn't wrap my head around how she could just walk away so easily, without any remorse. I felt hollow, like the foundation of my life had crumbled beneath me, and all I had left were the broken pieces of what I thought was a happy marriage. But I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here, letting her dictate the terms while I suffered in silence. If she wanted out, if she wanted happiness at the expense of everything we'd built, then I would have to face that. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My mind was still spinning, replaying everything Sarah had said. It was as if her words were burned into my memory, haunting me no matter how much I tried to push them away. She left early, heading out before I even got out of bed. Not a note, no explanation, nothing. She'd simply vanished for the day, as if she couldn't bear to be in the same house as me. I sat alone in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, watching the kids play in the yard, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. My heart broke a little more, knowing they were caught in the middle of this mess. I'd spent so much time trying to shield them, to give them a stable home. And now, everything was falling apart because of one selfish choice, one betrayal. A thought struck me then, a painful, ugly thought that I hadn't been able to shake since that night at the party. How long had this been going on? I didn't know if I could handle the answer, but I couldn't live in the dark anymore. I needed the truth. All of it. I waited until the kids were settled with a movie, then went to the office, where Sarah had left her laptop. It was still logged in, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I might find. But I had to know. I started by checking her emails, hoping for some kind of clue, something that would tell me how deep this betrayal went. And that's when I found it. an email thread between her and Mike, hidden in a folder labeled work stuff, as if that would be enough to cover her tracks. The messages were short but revealing. They were planning meetups at a local hotel, sneaking around on the weekends, and finding any excuse to be alone together. The words were casual, as if this whole thing was no big deal, just a fun escape from the mundanity of real life. They joked about their secret rendezvous, even had code words to keep it hidden. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I scrolled, reading how she'd referred to me as the roommate, how she'd mocked the time I'd taken the kids out to the park so she could have some me time, only to spend it with him. It wasn't just physical either. There were messages where she confided in him about our arguments, about my shortcomings as a husband. She painted herself as this victim, trapped in a loveless marriage, craving excitement and happiness. But the worst was yet to come. There, in one of the older messages, I found plans for a surprise. A hotel room booked under her name for what I realized was supposed to be the weekend of our anniversary. While I'd been at home, trying to put together a special night for us, she'd been with him, celebrating in a way that made me sick to think about. It was then that everything clicked: the late nights, the sudden need for personal space, her insistence that I didn't care enough. She'd been living a double life, right under my nose, and I'd been too blind to see it. I closed the laptop, unable to stomach another word. I felt broken, hollowed out, like she'd ripped a piece of me away that I'd never get back. When Sarah got home later that afternoon, I was waiting for her. She walked in, cheerful, tossing her bag onto the counter without a care in the world. She barely even glanced at me as she started making herself a coffee. The casualness of it all, the indifference, it set my blood boiling. I didn't hold back this time. I found the emails, Sarah. I know everything. She froze, her hand hovering over the coffee machine. For a split second, I thought I saw panic in her eyes, but she quickly masked it, turning to me with that same indifferent expression. "Oh," she said, setting her mug down. "So you went through my stuff?" Her tone was calm, almost accusatory, as if I was the one who'd done something wrong. The audacity of it made my skin crawl. "You don't get to turn this around on me, Sarah," I snapped. "You've been lying to me, sneaking around, treating me like some clueless idiot while you carried on this, whatever this is with him." My voice broke, a mixture of anger and pain that I could barely contain. She sighed, rolling her eyes as if I was just an annoyance she had to deal with. "Look, I told you I was unhappy. You knew things weren't right between us. Maybe if you'd listened to me, if you'd tried harder, we wouldn't be in this situation." There it was again, that smug, unapologetic tone that was slowly driving me over the edge. "So this is my fault? You think sneaking around with him was somehow justified because I wasn't listening enough? You know what, Sarah? I would have done anything for you. I loved you, and all you had to do was be honest." She shook her head, as if she couldn't believe I still didn't understand. "I don't need to justify myself to you. I did what I had to do to feel alive, to feel like myself again. And maybe if you'd been paying attention, you'd understand that." Her words cut deeper than any insult ever could. It was clear now. There was no remorse, no regret. She didn't even care that she'd shattered our family, betrayed our vows, and lied to me for months. She stood there, arms crossed, looking at me like I was the one being unreasonable. I couldn't believe it. The woman I'd loved, the mother of my children, was standing there without a shred of empathy, no acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused. I stared at her, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. This wasn't the Sarah I thought I knew. This was someone else entirely. A person willing to rewrite history to make herself feel better, to absolve herself of any guilt. And in that moment, I knew there was no saving this. She'd made her choice, and I couldn't keep pretending there was anything left to fight for. "Fine," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "If that's how you really feel, then I think we're done here." I walked past her, heading toward the stairs. As I did, she called out behind me, her tone still unbothered. "What? So you're just going to give up? Just like that?" I turned back, meeting her gaze one last time. "You already gave up, Sarah. You just didn't have the guts to admit it. And with that, I walked upstairs, leaving her standing in the kitchen, looking stunned for the first time all day. But I didn't feel triumphant or even relieved. I felt empty, like I'd lost a part of myself that I'd never get back. As I lay in bed that night, I realized that the Sarah I'd loved, the woman I'd built my life with, was gone. Or maybe she'd never been real at all. The following days felt surreal, like I was drifting through someone else's life. Sarah and I hardly spoke. We moved around each other in the house like strangers, exchanging the bare minimum of words when it came to the kids or daily chores. I could see in her eyes that she expected me to get over it, to move past everything and accept whatever twisted version of reality she decided was best for herself. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't pretend like everything was fine when every time I looked at her, all I saw were the lies. I'd been putting off calling a lawyer. Some part of me hoped, in spite of everything, that she might realize what she'd done, that she might snap out of this. But after the confrontation over those emails, I knew better. She wasn't coming back. Or maybe, like I'd started to believe, the person I thought I'd married had never really been there at all. One morning, as I sat in the kitchen scrolling through my phone, a message notification popped up from my brother, Mark. He'd sensed something was wrong after our last conversation. He kept it casual, asking if I wanted to come over for a beer or if I needed to talk. I stared at the message for a long time, realizing how isolated I'd become. Sarah had been my whole world, my best friend, the person I confided in about everything. And now, that trust was shattered. I decided it was time to open up. So that night, after the kids were in bed, I drove over to Mark's. As soon as I walked in, he gave me a knowing look, like he already understood how broken I was. I could barely get the words out, but once I started talking, everything spilled out. The suspicions, the texts, the affair, the cold way she blamed me. Mark listened, letting me vent, never interrupting, just letting me finally get it all off my chest. When I finished, he shook his head. I don't know what to say, man. I always thought Sarah was, well, I thought she was different. But the way you're describing her, that's someone I don't know. Yeah, I murmured, feeling the weight of it. It's someone I don't know either. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing what this meant. Finally, Mark asked me, "So, what are you going to do?" The question hit me like a punch. I'd been so wrapped up in the shock, in the betrayal, that I hadn't thought far beyond it. But now, as I sat there, it became painfully clear. This marriage was over. There was no coming back from this, no mending what she'd broken. Even if I tried, I'd always wonder if she was lying, if she was hiding something. I'd never trust her again. And a marriage without trust? It was no marriage at all. I think it's time to let her go, I said finally, the words tasting bitter but strangely liberating. Saying it out loud made it feel real, like I was taking the first step toward something new, even if it was painful. Mark nodded, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. You deserve better, you know? You deserve someone who values you, who doesn't take you for granted. His words sank in, and for the first time, I felt a tiny glimmer of hope. I hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't wanted to lose my family. But if Sarah was willing to throw it all away, then maybe, just maybe, I deserved a chance at real happiness. A chance to rebuild my life, even if that meant starting over. The next day, I contacted a lawyer. I explained everything, leaving out no detail, feeling a mix of relief and grief with every word. The lawyer was professional, calm, and matter-of-fact. He'd heard stories like mine before, countless times, and there was something strangely comforting in his steady, no-nonsense tone. He advised me on the best way to approach things with the kids, told me about my rights regarding the house, our assets, everything. By the end of the meeting, I had a clear plan. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew there would be moments I'd question myself, moments I'd miss the life we'd had. But I also knew that I couldn't keep living this way, haunted by the ghost of the love I thought we shared. It took everything in me to tell Sarah I wanted a divorce. Even after all she'd done, after the cold indifference and all the lies, part of me still felt the weight of the years we'd spent together. But I'd crossed a line internally, a point of no return where I couldn't keep fooling myself. I wasn't doing this just for me. I was doing it for the kids too. They deserved a father who wasn't weighed down by betrayal, a man who could be present and whole for them. Staying in this broken relationship wasn't fair to them. One evening, after I got the kids settled in their rooms, I found Sarah in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely unaware of the decision I was about to share with her. She looked up as I entered the room, her eyes questioning. I could see that she sensed something was different, something more final in the way I looked at her. "Sarah," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, "I think we both know this isn't working. We've been avoiding it, dancing around the issue, but it's time we face the reality. I can't do this anymore. I want a divorce." For a moment, she just stared at me, as if the words hadn't fully registered. Then she laughed, a short, dismissive sound that made my blood boil. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "You're being dramatic. We've had arguments before, and now you think divorce is the answer? That's just pathetic." Her reaction stunned me. Even now, she didn't understand the impact of her actions, didn't grasp the depth of the betrayal I felt. She truly believed that I would just, forgive her, move on as if nothing had happened? "I'm not being dramatic," I replied, my voice hardening. "This isn't just another argument, Sarah. You betrayed me. You lied to me. You destroyed the trust we had, and there's no fixing that. I can't stay with someone who doesn't respect me, who doesn't value our family enough to even try to be honest." She scoffed, brushing a lock of hair out of her face. "Well, if you think you're such a martyr, then fine. Go ahead. But don't expect me to grovel or beg you to stay. I have my own life to live, and I don't need you holding me back." It was as if she'd slapped me. I had expected anger, maybe even regret, but instead, she just looked annoyed, like this was a mere inconvenience to her, another hurdle in her quest for happiness. I realized in that moment that the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built my life with, was truly gone. Or maybe she'd never been there at all, just a figment of my imagination. "Fine," I said, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "If that's how you feel, then there's really nothing left to say." I stood up, walking away before the weight of everything could sink in too deeply. That night, I packed a small bag and slept in the guest room. I knew I couldn't leave the house, not yet, not until we had a plan for the kids, but I wanted to set a boundary, to make it clear that things were changing. The next few days were a blur of meetings with the lawyer, emails back and forth, and paperwork. It was exhausting, but with each step, I felt a bit lighter, a bit more certain that I was making the right decision. I started thinking about the future, about how I could rebuild my life, piece by piece, into something stable, something real. Finally, it was time to break the news to the kids. I dreaded it more than anything else. They were so young, so innocent, and I knew they wouldn't understand. I wanted to protect them, to shield them from the pain, but there was no way around it. They deserved honesty, even if it would hurt. Sarah and I sat them down together one evening, just the four of us. She seemed strangely calm, almost indifferent, while I could barely hold myself together. Our daughter, always the observant one, immediately sensed something was wrong. Her eyes darted between us, her little brows knitting together in worry. "Honey," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "your mom and I have something important to tell you. We both love you very much, and that will never change. But we've decided that we're not going to be living together anymore." Our son looked confused, his little hands gripping the edge of the couch. "Does that mean you're getting divorced?" he asked quietly, surprising me with his maturity. I nodded, struggling to find the right words. "Yes, buddy, it does. But that doesn't mean we don't love you both with all our hearts. We'll always be here for you, no matter what." Our daughter's eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in my shoulder, crying quietly. I held her close, feeling my heart break all over again. This was the part I dreaded most. Watching my kids suffer because of decisions they didn't understand, because of mistakes they had nothing to do with. Sarah sat stiffly on the other end of the couch, her face expressionless, as if she were already somewhere else, in a world that didn't include us. The days after breaking the news to the kids felt like navigating a minefield. They would go from quiet acceptance to outbursts of confusion and sadness. Our son, who'd always been more reserved, tried to act tough, but I'd catch him staring out the window, lost in thought, and it broke my heart every time. My daughter clung to me more, asking when things would be normal again, and it was all I could do not to cry right along with her. Sarah, on the other hand, was a ghost around the house. She'd vanish for hours on end, her explanations vague, her excuses even thinner. She was distant, disconnected from the kids and from me, moving through life as if she'd already left. A few weeks passed, and the divorce proceedings began in earnest. Sarah and I spoke through lawyers more than directly. When we did talk, it was stiff, awkward, and purely logistical. There was no warmth, no familiarity left between us. Just two people divided by years of love that had curdled into resentment. She wanted her freedom, she said, a fresh start, and I was ready to let her go. One afternoon, while going through old boxes in the garage, I came across some photos from when we were younger, before the kids, before the mortgage, before all the stress of life wore us down. There was a picture of us at the beach, sunburned and grinning, arms wrapped around each other like we never wanted to let go. I felt a pang of sorrow for that version of us, the two young people who had looked so full of hope. I couldn't recognize myself in those photos anymore, and I wondered if she felt the same. As hard as it was, those memories helped me realize that while I'd lost something, I wasn't truly empty. I still had the kids, who were my world, and I still had the chance to rebuild, to rediscover who I was outside of this marriage. Slowly, I began to take steps toward my own healing. I started going for long walks, something I hadn't done in years, just to clear my head. I took up reading again, falling back into novels I'd loved before life got so busy. And I began seeing a therapist, something my brother had urged me to do, even though I'd resisted at first. It wasn't easy talking to a stranger about everything, but it helped. Little by little, I started to feel the weight lifting. One evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, my daughter asked if things would ever go back to the way they were. I paused, searching for an answer that would be honest but still give her comfort. I don't think things will go back to exactly how they were, I said gently. But that doesn't mean we can't make new, happy memories together. You, your brother, and I, we're still a family, and we'll always be here for each other. She nodded, seeming to understand in her own way, and gave me a hug that felt tighter than any hug before. That simple moment meant more to me than anything. It reminded me that, even in the middle of loss, there was still something solid and real to hold on to. As the divorce finalized, Sarah moved into an apartment nearby. We'd worked out a shared custody arrangement, but I found myself dreading the days when the kids would go stay with her. It wasn't that I didn't want them to see their mom. I just worried about the kind of environment she'd create for them. But I knew I had to let go of that too. I couldn't control her choices, couldn't hold onto anger forever. All I could do was be the best father I could be. Months passed. Gradually, I started to feel whole again, to see glimpses of a future that wasn't clouded by betrayal and hurt. I still had tough days, anniversaries, birthdays, all those little reminders of what we'd once been. But each time the pain resurfaced, it felt a little easier to bear, a little less all-consuming. One day, while watching the kids play at the park, I realized I was smiling. Not a forced smile, not one meant to reassure them or anyone else, but a genuine, unburdened smile. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for the life I could build with my kids, for the person I was rediscovering myself to be. If there's anything I've learned from this experience, it's that love isn't enough on its own. Trust, honesty, respect, those things matter just as much, if not more. I learned that sometimes letting go is the only way to truly move forward, to free yourself from a version of life that no longer serves you. If anyone out there is going through something similar, my advice is this: give yourself grace. It's okay to feel lost, to feel broken, but remember, healing is possible, even when it feels out of reach. It takes time, it takes strength, and it takes faith in the fact that better days can and will come. The journey isn't easy, but it's worth it. And one day, you'll find yourself on the other side, stronger and more whole than you ever thought possible.